So, welcome. It's really a treat to see this room packed with people for the presentation of our little book about high-rise housing. We're really flattered that you all took time out of your evening to come. I'm chairing the session tonight. I'm a researcher at LSE, where I've been for 23 years, and I mainly do urban and housing research in a little research unit called LSE London. My first task is to welcome you all to the LSE. Some of you might have been students here, some of you probably know the campus very well, but for those of you who don't, this is one of our 27 buildings, and looking at its history earlier today, found that this was designed in 1909 by a Scottish architect to be the headquarters of a major insurance company. And that's what most of LSE's buildings are like. They're repurposed from other uses, but we do have three very spectacular pieces of contemporary architecture that are elsewhere on the campus, and if you have time after this, you should go and have a look at them. For those who need the loos, they are downstairs in the basement. There's a lift outside, and it goes down one floor. Tonight's event will be a series of short presentations and then a discussion, and if my timing is right and my colleagues and I are disciplined, we will be finished by 7:30, and we will have time for more drinks and discussion and carry on the conversation that we've been having. I wanted to say a little bit about how the book came about. The group coalesced over a period of about 4 years through a shared interest in and concern about high-rise buildings. We are an informal network that includes academics and professionals, architects, lawyers, who have worked on various aspects of high-rises. We're not anti-high-rise, but equally we're not cheerleaders for high-rises. We want to ensure that the buildings work well for the residents and for their surrounding neighborhoods. So we put together this little set of essays to set out the main issues as we see them, and to identify the gaps in our knowledge. We hope they open a discussion and lead to research that can improve the policy around these buildings and the design of them. Now, Grenfell, of course, happened almost 5 years ago. That wasn't the reason that we came together, but it's clearly an unavoidable part of the context when there's any discussion of high-rise buildings, and it highlighted many of the issues that we'll be talking about today. I'll say just a little bit about what we mean by high-rise buildings, because there are several definitions that are used for different purposes. We are talking about buildings that are 30 meters tall or 10 stories or more, but we do refer in several places to the Tall Building Survey run by New London Architecture, and their definition starts at 20 stories. And just the final thing before I move into my the slides about my bits. The last time I was in this room was the 16th of March, 2020, so 7 days before lockdown, when we launched another book in this room, and possibly some of you were here. It was this book, Living in a Denser London, and it examines the experience of living in 11 high-density schemes in London. So a few days after that event, lockdown happened, and the books were never distributed. So those who are interested, I invite you to take a copy as you leave, because many of the themes are similar to the themes of today's book. I'm going to say a little bit about existing research into well-being in high-rise housing, and then about a little survey that we ran that's reported in this book about those who are living in high-density housing. So in the UK, high-rise buildings historically were mainly social housing, and that's not true everywhere. For example, in Manhattan, it's a different picture. But there has been a change in the last 30 years, as we're all familiar with the kinds of buildings that have been going up along the Thames and in places like Croydon and Ealing and everywhere, really. Social scientists have done research into the experience of living in these buildings. They identify some positive things. There's more space, for green areas, potentially. They have good views, especially if you're on the high floors. Less maintenance work for residents. Residents may feel more secure and less fear of crime. But also some negative effects, including fear, stress, behavior problems amongst children, and low levels of interaction with neighbors. A strong theme that runs through a lot of this research is that high-rise buildings are not appropriate places to live with small children. However, a lot of this research was done many decades ago. A lot of it was done in response to identified problem neighborhoods or problem buildings. So it's not really clear how generalizable that is to the kinds of tall buildings that we're building today, where there's much greater emphasis on placemaking and social interaction and so on. And I think that's something we need to know more about. So as part of this research, we did a survey of current residents of leaseholders in high-rise and high-density buildings. Most, but not all, of the respondents were from London. There's currently no systematic source of data about leaseholder charges and what they cover, and that, gap was very much identified in the wake of Grenfell. So just as an indicative picture, what we found was that amongst our survey respondents, and this wasn't a random survey, the median service charge was £208 a month, and the range went from £80 a month to $750, with one very outlier of more than £3,000 a month. What was really interesting was the degree of dissatisfaction with the service that was provided in exchange for these charges. 68% said they were quite or very unhappy with the scheme management, mainly because of lack of responsiveness, not knowing what the expenditure was covered, and poor workmanship when there were repairs paid for out of the maintenance fee. And these were some of the physical issues that people identified in their buildings. And the headline there, I think, is maybe should concern those of us who are involved in these buildings. 75% of the people who are living in these buildings hoped not to be living in them in 5 years' time, but would prefer to be in a house. I'm going to hand over now to Dickon Robinson. In the interest of time, I will allow you to read each little introduction. Dickon, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you. Good evening. Fantastic to see such a large turnout to discover that the things which have been fascinating us over the past few years have obviously fascinate you too. So I'm going to talk a bit about high-rise, and I'm going to talk about leaseholders, and I'm going to talk about costs in use. And I wonder how widely appreciated it is, or one way of looking at the business of acquiring a leasehold is that when you acquire that, you're basically signing an open check to your freeholder to pay a share of the long-term costs of repairing and maintaining that building. Now, as we know, service charges cover routine and regular activity, cleaning common parts, grounds maintenance, servicing lifts, and so on and so forth. They're often a contentious issue, and as we've been told, there's often a lot of dissatisfaction, but they're actually not the issue we're interested in this book. What we are interested in is the impact of the inexorable process of decay and obsolescence, which affects every building from the day it's completed. And that's an issue I spent a working life grappling with, first for the London Borough of Camden and then for the Peabody Trust. For major residential landlords, this is their fourth bridge. It's a never-ending program of repairs, maintenance, external painting, replacing individual boilers, new kitchens, bathrooms, and so on every 15, 20 years. But the really big bills start after about 30 with major capital investment programs, replacing windows, lifts, fire doors, roof coverings, rewiring, and so on, often driven by new regulatory requirements as well as disrepair. Now, those costs are difficult for social landlords to fund as they can't recover the expenditure by raising rents. And they're frankly eye-watering for ex-right-to-buy leaseholders who find bills for 40 to 60,000 and more unbelievably unaffordable. So what's this got to do with the brave new world of high-rise resi? Well, the short answer is those buildings will also decay, and their services will become obsolete. However, by virtue of their height and their increasingly sophisticated construction, those costs of repair and renewal are likely to be greater. We don't, of course, know this for sure because the kind of high-rise we're talking about is in the private sector is a relatively new housing typology in this country. But we can at least reflect on what can be learned from the experience of local authority high-rise over the 70-odd years that they've been in existence. And of course, we can learn from overseas. Foremost in most of our minds will, of course, be Grenfell Tower, where it's worth remembering that the reason for undertaking the work in the first instance was the need to replace windows and improve insulation. And the motivation for specifying substandard and dangerous materials was cost-cutting to reduce overall costs to fit into an inadequate budget. So one consequence that we've learnt indirectly from that experience is that the legal framework of leasehold tenure diverts all costs away from freeholders and places them on leaseholders. We've also learned a great deal about the very considerable cost of replacing cladding at height, and another revelation has been the unacceptable extent of poor workmanship, where liability is often elusive and remediation so expensive. So looking more widely, there must now be relatively few residential towers of the 50s, 60s and 70s that haven't been either comprehensively modernised or demolished. In aggregate, those costs are probably much greater than the original construction costs. And in the commercial property sector, it's useful to reflect on how many post-war office buildings and retail buildings have already been demolished and redeveloped, which raises the question of what life we're designing our new buildings for. When I've asked architects and others working on high-rise residential designs what life the client has specified, answers are often surprisingly vague, usually hovering somewhere around about 60 years. Surprisingly short, in my opinion, for buildings being sold on 250 and 999-year leases. In the private sector, which is our concern, those costs, when they occur, will fall on leaseholders. And we worry we're storing up an unfundable liability that will impact ordinary leaseholders sooner or later. This, of course, is what sinking funds are for. But if we don't know what those costs will be and when they will occur, it's highly unlikely that we'll put away enough money to deal with them. And if sinking funds are inadequate and these inevitable costs are unaffordable to some or most of the leaseholders, essential work will be deferred, and ultimately buildings will become unsafe and unattractive to live in. Reports from Tower Hamlets of the indefinite closure of high-level communal gardens in post-millennial towers may be a straw in the wind. It's been suggested that if leaseholders collectively take on their freeholds, they'll be in a position to protect their interests more effectively than distant property companies. However, as Douglas describes in his contribution to our book, if leasehold ownership companies have no resources other than those provided by leaseholders, they are at risk of bankruptcy if leaseholders don't cough up when billed. So as we focus on net zero and embodied energy, our previous willingness to demolish and rebuild obsolescent housing stock looks increasingly unacceptable. The towers we have built and are currently building are here to stay, and we need to ensure that they're affordable in the long term for those to whom they are sold. So what's to be done? Placing even greater emphasis on designing out obsolescence and minimizing long-term cost in use as part of the drive to zero carbon is, of course, a no-brainer. But just as importantly, we must recognize we need to do a lot more research into the experience of leaseholders, managing agents, freeholders on the performance of those towers built since the millennium. We need to search actively for patterns of failure, and we need, of course, to nail down what's worked well so that we can replicate it. Fundamentally, we need to model the long-term performance of each component and service in these buildings and draw up for each building a lifetime costed reinvestment program. BIM design programs give us the tools, and we have the professional expertise to undertake this work if clients and local authorities were to require it. We recommend that in future this should be made mandatory and be made available to leaseholders at the point of sale so that they can see what their liabilities will be. Now, some of you may feel that seeing those liabilities in cold print will prove a serious disincentive to prospective purchasers. It may. It may. However, without it, there would seem to me to be a whiff of mis-selling in the air. And it's my belief that transparency around real costs would lead to improvements in the long-term quality and reliability of this housing typology. And I would also hope that it would lead to the development of smart financial products which would ensure that sinking funds would provide a much more effective insurance against those inevitable costs. So in conclusion, high-rise residential can be a useful form of housing provision. It is definitely well and much appreciated by many occupants, although our survey suggests that the great majority of leaseholders hope to be living in a house within 5 years. It needs to be in the right place, and it needs to be occupied by people who can afford the inevitable long-term costs. At present, there's little evidence that we know how large those costs will be, or when they will occur, or who will be able to afford them. Until we do, it would seem to be prudent to be rather more circumspect in building high. Developers and their professional teams need to focus on understanding cost over time in order to reassure us that this form of housing has a place in our cities.
Thank you, Dickon. I'm sure that there will be many of you who would like to ask questions or respond, but let's save that till the end of the session. May I ask Roger to come up from Paula Thomas Edwards?
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the complexity of high-rise housing, particularly in 3 distinct phases: the design, construction and maintenance. Now, first of all, this isn't a critique on design. We didn't have time for that. We've never finished the essays. So it's just about technical, really, my bit. So firstly, the regulations. So the regulations, policies and guidance that we follow when designing our buildings to ensure they're safe and robust and fit for purpose haven't really kept pace with the reality of modern construction. The building regulations were developed to suit modest, low-rise, traditional construction methods, load-bearing masonry, timber, that kind of thing. Although they've evolved incrementally over the years to address more complex scenarios and different materials and building techniques, we now have a situation where different regulations are pulling in different directions, creating lots and lots of problems for us. An example is the building regulations promote natural ventilation and daylight to reduce energy demand, whereas planning policy, concerned with noise and pollution, often results in closed, sealed facades and mechanical ventilation, increasing energy use. A new building regulation that's been published recently, Part O, deals with overheating. It addresses overheating, which is very welcome, but seems to have been developed in isolation of other requirements, including the need to provide natural daylight and sunlight in our homes. And of course, it's likely to lead to a proliferation of external shading devices, adding cost and maintenance, and particularly on high-rise buildings which don't benefit from shading by other buildings or trees. So moving on to the construction, as regulations have focused on better performance, construction has also therefore become more specialist, with testing required to prove compliance. Construction of modern high-rise apartment blocks has additional complexity. Increasing height means lighter materials are required, materials that flex, and also additional components required. And height also brings additional cost, and some examples are, so the structure, so the higher you go, the greater fire resistance you need, more concrete, more steel. The weight of that structure in itself has to be supported, more increased structure. This is compounded at height as well. Also, exposure to weather and extremes needs to be addressed, particularly at high rise with wind and rain. And only specialist systems which have been tested thoroughly will be adequate. And again, that comes with complex additions with additional seals and fixings. And of course, the drive to reduce operational and embodied carbon introduces a further set of urgent challenges that the methods and materials that we use. With regards to safety in construction, significant costs have been added, particularly to high-rise housing, as the building regulations have gradually been updated. And many of these changes were a result of the Grenfell tragedy, which clearly we had to look at ourselves and decide what we needed to do as an industry. An example is clearly high-rise buildings now, there's a limit on the use of combustible materials. Of course, this is very sensible, and we shouldn't question that, but materials that were once considered low risk are now banned, and alternative solutions are required. So in the publication, we illustrate how construction methods have evolved from traditional Victorian construction, which just had 3 components, brick, mortar and plaster, right through to the equivalent modern apartment building, which now has typically maybe 15 to 20 individual components that make up that wall, from masonry elements, boards, membranes, metal framing, sealants, insulation and fastening. So moving on to the maintenance. So maintenance beyond the day-to-day cleaning and general upkeep does need to be addressed, and Dickon mentioned this. It's particularly important where there's mixed tenure and the leaseholders occupy the building, where the building fabric is the responsibility of the freeholder and not the people that live there. So how do we know if the building is going to be robust enough and low maintenance? So regulations do not actually focus on long-term performance and durability. They require that the material is suitable for its intended use. So a membrane, waterproof membrane, has to keep the water out, but there are no provisions for longevity. So of course we can look to guarantees for building components to determine how long they might last, but these are rarely for periods beyond 25 or 30 years. And this is very out of step with leases, which typically run from 125 years upwards. So we should expect, in the lifetime of building, that most of those components will need to be replaced several times. Now, the complications that gives us is, say, for example, windows. Windows will have a 10-year guarantee, and cladding panels. And the cladding panels have very similar guarantees. They often need to require a defined cleaning regime to validate that guarantee. This doesn't happen. And imagine the expense of replacing these components when they're embedded together, they're difficult to get to, they're at height, scaffolding, that kind of thing. It's very difficult. Also, how do we replace components that are actually layered and interdependent with each other? How do you get to those elements? We don't believe that long-term costs and complexity are properly understood yet and quantified in high-rise housing. So just come to some recommendations that we made. So we have some recommendations to deal with the inherent complexity that high-rise residential buildings give us. So review of the building regulations. They should provide definitive and bespoke guidance for buildings of height and provide a coordinated guidance framework that is practical. Building regulations and planning policies should maybe align for high-rise buildings, maybe above 10 stories, and both focus on lifetime costs and robustness, as well as safety at the point of completion. The construction industry also needs to rethink how best to build at height. There are new approaches being developed, but they need to be underpinned by better research and development and supported by legislation and guidance. Setting up an independent testing organisation for research of these products and systems is important. And these systems need to be tested, certified as components and elements together. So hopefully these points will help to make high-rise buildings perform better, be safer and provide more predictable value. Thank you.
7 minutes.
Thank you very much for that. Now I'm going to invite Andrew Beharrell to come up, and it would be disappointing if there were a presentation with lots of architects that didn't have some lovely images, and Andrew has some of those.
Good evening. Nice to see you all. Yes, I have pictures, I hope. Yeah, excellent. So the study that I and colleagues have been looking at is to do with the amount of public and shared open space delivered by developments involving tall buildings. And we're looking at this as just one example of the wider social and environmental impacts of superdensity. Most of us claim to value open space, and we have all sorts of planning policies to protect and enhance it, and to prevent degrading and overburdening it. And our study contains examples of widely differing provision in superdense developments, ranges from the generous to the non-existent. And this begs some important questions about how much do we really value open space, and whether related planning policies are being relegated in order to achieve housing growth targets. And it may be that delivering more homes justifies a reduction in access to open space, or it may be that we need to rethink our approach to high-rise housing. In any event, we need better evidence on which to base such decisions. When I trailed this study at the NLA last year and asked whether anyone thought open space is a waste of space, one audience member, is he here tonight? Made a forceful argument that quality matters more than quantity. Well, I think you need both. Exquisite, private, curated courtyards do have a part to play, but loose fit, open to all parks matter more. As the architects in the room all know, the original European concept for tall towers was that they would sit in parkland. The towers were to be surrounded by green open space which also flowed beneath the buildings. And by building tall, the built footprint is reduced, the ground plane is liberated, and try saying that in French, and everyone enjoys views of and access to the landscape. This was the vision taken up by the architects and planners of Britain's post-war reconstruction. Now, by definition, very dense developments introduce large numbers of additional people into an area, and this can help to support new and existing services and amenities, but it can also cause stress and competition where they're inadequate. The open space challenge applies also to relatively dense mid-rise development, but it's especially acute in super dense tall developments, which introduce a concentrated population spike on confined sites. Access to open space is vital for our well-being. It helps us connect with nature, it provides room for socializing and physical exercise, and it increases biodiversity in the built environment. The pandemic saw the closure of some of London's parks because too many people wanted to use them. And while we hope to put all that behind us, it reminds us that our parks cannot sustain limitless increases in the intensity of use, and some can get just as crowded on any hot July weekend. Now, London has lots of existing open space, and this translates into a pretty good average of open space per person. We also compare quite favorably with other global cities. So on the face of it, we're starting in a good place, with plenty to sustain our projected 10 million population in 2031. But the amount of open space in each London borough varies widely, from Islington with 8 square metres per person to Bromley with 259. Tower Hamlets, the borough with the greatest number of tall buildings, has 17 square metres per person. And studies also show a correlation between London's poorest boroughs and open space. For example, 39% of people in Tower Hamlets live in poverty, compared to 17% in Bromley. Furthermore, our residential growth areas, and therefore many of our tall buildings, tend to be located in former industrial areas, which in turn coincide with areas of open space deficit. Now, how much open space does London need? The idea that every citizen should have ready access to green open space is enshrined in the NPPF, in the London Plan, and in the local plans of every London borough. And here's a list of just some of the London Plan 21 relevant policies. But there's no London Plan target or formula to ensure a minimum amount of open space to be provided alongside every new housing development, or found from existing capacity. Some boroughs may and do have that. Camden has recently introduced its own target, and it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. Patrick Abercrombie, the father of the London Plan, recognised the same open space deficit in the inner London working class boroughs, and he had more specific ideas to remedy it. He couldn't have foreseen London's 20th century housing challenges and the response to them, but our study shows how current development measures up to his standard of 16 square metres per person. So we began by assessing some of our own projects at Pollard Thomas Edwards. These are in the 10 to 20 story range. We have none above that, and found that they delivered an average of around 8 square metres of shared and public open space per person. Not bad, but half of what Abercrombie was seeking. Those projects also tend to fit within the old and, in my case, mourned GLA density matrix. We then looked at 4 of London's largest regeneration areas, and we found a very wide range of provision, from 18 square metres per person to less than half a square metre, from radiant city to highly urbanised environment. And there's much more commentary and breakdown and explanation of these figures in the book. We also try to get a handle on what we call footprint development, standalone towers. Many planning applications for towers are of this nature, single towers or maybe a pair on very confined sites. They provide little or no street-level public open space. Often these are former commercial sites and they're remote from nearby residential areas with parks. And to get a rough estimate of how they are, we extrapolated from the NLA survey with the help of Knight Frank. So what next? This is really a starting point, I hope. We're calling for more comprehensive and continuing research, far more research resource needed than we were able to bring to it, and that this should help to inform decisions about London's future character and built form, including the case for a minimum target amount of nearby open public open space for every additional resident. Because we do have a choice about whether and where to continue building tall and how to meet the growing challenges which that entails, including the provision of open space and the other challenges covered in this set of essays. So let's make that an informed choice. Thank you.
Thank you. For the final main presentation, June Barnes is coming up, and she's really been the driving force behind all of us in this project, so we owe her a great debt of gratitude.
Well, firstly, because I've seen some of you taking photographs, you're all going to get a copy of this, and there's a lot of stuff in there. We're only scratching the surface. So I'm going to draw together the main conclusions and recommendations of the report, particularly focusing on leaseholders, which is where we started thinking about this. And Dickon has explained the issues about leaseholders. And just to pick up on them, over the last 30 years, we've seen a move from most leaseholders living in small blocks of flats and in converted houses. And we've seen a move to high density, large blocks of flats and increasingly tall buildings. And we believe that the size and tenure complexity of high-rise housing makes for poor management and poor maintenance, as the current regulation and good practice guidance around setting service charges and sinking funds is just inadequate for the task that we're now facing. So just think about context. A tower of 20 stories with 8 flats per floor is 160 flats, 160 homes, 160 occupants and families and others. Now, some of these will be leaseholders who have bought and are living in those flats. Others will be leaseholders who've bought and are letting the flats out. There'll be some people who are shared owners. There'll be others who are renting from housing associations, and it's the housing association that is the leaseholder. So we've got 160 flats with a range of different ownerships, and some of whom don't live in the property that they own. And there's no obligation currently on developers of new high-rise housing to provide information on the likely costs of repair and replacement, which makes it very difficult to assess the proper level of service charges and sinking funds on day one. So people are buying with an expectation of what the costs will be, but often the developer has pitched the costs against what else is being built in the area. So is it any surprise that these complex buildings are difficult to maintain? We also found that increasingly the preferred approach post-development is that the developer will sell or pass on these days to a leasehold management company. And the leasehold management company is where every leaseholder in that building, or who has ownership in that building, has a share of responsibility of maintaining the building. And this is done, as Dickon pointed out, with minimal resources. At day one, there is nothing, and every bit of money that comes in is from people's service charges. So the income stream is limited, and there are limited remedies for those people, for those leasehold management companies who have leaseholders who are either unwilling or unable to pay. So we're already seeing this post-Grenfell with people being faced very significant bills which they simply cannot afford. And it's made more complicated if some of the leaseholders don't live in the home that they have bought. They live either in other parts of the country or even abroad. Finally, we believe that many leaseholders really... Oh, I haven't put the first slide up. How do I do it? There we go. Finally, we believe that many leaseholders do not really understand the responsibilities they're taking on. They're buying 250-year leases and actually, in many cases, 999-year leases. So those of you who are living in houses, who have the luxury of living in houses, and I'm one of them, do you think your house is going to last 999 years? And yet we think that a 40-storey block of flats will. So here are some recommendations. So for leaseholders, we really have to regulate the way service charges and sinking funds are set. The government has the powers to do this under the Housing and Regeneration Act 2008. It simply hasn't used them and relies on best practice from other organisations. So you get a whole load of different ways in which service charges are calculated and information is provided. Leaseholders should expect service charges and sinking funds to be set in the same way and to be provided with minimum standards of information. And this should be across the housing sector, not just people who've bought from the private sector, but also people who are leaseholders of councils and of housing associations. There also must be a code of practice for solicitors and conveyancers to provide good information to prospective purchasers. There should be unambiguous requirements to provide leaseholders with information on both their obligations and their rights. Roger and Andrew have already covered a lot of this, but it's essential that we get building regulations, we review building regulations, and they align with other policies. We must do more research and development on the way we build high buildings. And we must look at things like public open space provision. Of course, there are other important recommendations. We must look at the use of incentives that encourage marginal homeowners to purchase high-rise housing. So Help to Buy, soft loans, has encouraged an awful lot of people into high-rise housing, particularly in outer London, where prices are pitched at 600,000, which just happens to be the threshold for Help to Buy. So we have a lot of people who were stretched buying their home and are even more stretched now, some of whom are facing the tsunami of having cladding removed and discovering the underlying construction is not adequate, fire stops not there and so on, and they're going to have to pick the cost up of that. I think that government and regional government need to look at development grant and whether it should be provided, particularly for family housing, for affordable rent in high-rise. All of the information in the past shows this is not a good idea. We need to understand whether it is and whether these are suitable places to be putting families. We might want to actively discourage high-rise development for people on moderate and modest and low incomes. Essential is to understand what we're doing and to do things which are informed by what we know. So we need to know about the satisfaction of people who are living in this high-rise housing. How much is it actually costing them? And we did try and find out what the cost of being a leaseholder was, and it is enormously difficult to find this out. And there absolutely needs to be research done on this. We need to understand how the way we improve the build of high-rise housing and think about the long term. And we also need to look at the positives. High-rise housing works for some people. We need to understand who it works for, why, and then replicate that. Thank you.
Thank you, June. We now have about 15 or 20 minutes for a panel discussion and questions. And joining us on the panel are Paul Eaton from Allies and Morrison and Douglas Rhodes from Travers and Hamlins, both of whom also contributed to the book. We have roving microphones, and let me just get those. They're there, and you need to hold the red button at the bottom for 5 seconds. So, who would like to start off with a question for the panel? In the middle there with a white jacket, please. Could you tell us who you are and ask your question? Thank you. There.
Great, thank you. Always wear a white jacket when you want to ask a question. I'm Selina Mason from Lend-Lease. Thank you very much. That was really fascinating, and I'm sorry I was in a little bit late, so I missed the first talk. But, and there's so much that I would love to talk about, but one question that hasn't been reflected, and I think would be interesting to hear your views on. We've obviously just developed Elephant Park in London, which include a park in the middle. All of your views about service charges, very good, and I agree regulation would be brilliant because it would create a level playing field against which all developers would then have to deliver, because it's incredibly price sensitive service charging. But where you deliver public open space, the public sector is unwilling or unable to stand in and maintain and manage it, and therefore it falls on the leaseholders and the service charges that they pay. Does the panel have any views about this? Because I agree entirely, we should not be building high density places without adequate amenity spaces and places for people to enjoy contact with nature.
Thank you. Andrew and perhaps Dickon, would you like to say briefly your views?
Yes, certainly. Can you hear me okay? Yep. Yes, thanks for that. We didn't study Elephant Park, which is a lovely place. Thank you. And I don't know what the figure is for that in terms of quantity. I think, firstly, to say I'm personally completely neutral about the question of who looks after open space. I know there's some people have very forceful opinions that public open space should be only maintained by public authorities. I don't hold that view. I think that private organisations are sometimes better fitted, and we've got some very good examples of London of that working. You quite rightly raised the question of who pays, and I think part of my answer to that comes back to this question of quality and quantity. And I've been interested to observe that a lot of high-profile, often high-budget developments in London provide relatively little or sometimes very little open space. I'm going to single out Nine Elms, I'm afraid, as an example of that. But they compensate for it by making that space extremely lavish, and both in its design and its execution and specification, very intricate. And they talk about curating or sometimes choreographing open space. And actually, as I said at the beginning, I think there's a greater need for a quantity of simple, easy to maintain open space. Just some grass, for heaven's sake, where you can have a picnic, kick a ball, maybe even walk a dog responsibly, and do all the other things that traditionally we do in parks.
Thanks. Dickon, anything to add?
Oh, well, just very briefly, I would say that it's my impression that planners effectively deprioritize the provision of open space in order to prioritize affordable housing and other infrastructure, education, and so on uses. And that's a kind of deep-set cultural issue within our planning profession and also within society. And I think that the really interesting issue about open space generally is how are we going to monetize it? How are we going to come up with a mechanism, society as a whole, I mean, to actually generate sufficient funding so that our open space can be well looked after? Islington, where I live, may have the least open space in London, but it certainly some of the worst, in my view. Which is not intended as a criticism of Islington. It's simply an observation that as a society, as a metropolitan society, as an urban society, we're not really prepared to put our hand in our pocket when it comes to open space, and we need to. We need to learn how to do that.
Thank you. There was another question over here, I think. Yes, with a nice bracelet.
Hi there, I'm Sana. Thank you very much, everybody, for speaking. It was really fascinating. I'm really interested in the idea of context. So the title of the book is Social Impact and Financial Impact of High-Rise Housing, and obviously I'm sure we can all give lots of examples globally where high-rise housing creates better communities. I know plenty of tall buildings in Asia and in the rest of Europe where living in a high-rise building, literally everybody knows everyone in their building. And it's created a community that I haven't seen living in a suburb of London, and the way people interact with each other. So I'm really fascinated as to how the findings, like how contextual these findings are. Like, do you think they are UK-based, London-based, even borough-based, even site-based? So yeah, I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Okay, thank you. I'll take that one to start with. In terms of the social findings in this book, they rely on existing research that was done mostly in the States and in this country. So very little reflects European experience, and there's nothing about Asia. And I agree that those kinds of places can perform completely differently for a range of reasons, depending on where they are. So there needs to be a lot more research into contemporary buildings of that kind in this country, and to understand why the buildings perform better in some places than in others. That is fundamental, and Dickon also talked about the need to learn from international experience, which sadly we have not done enough of. Would someone else like to address that?
I might just
Paul?
make one observation. I mean, I think we recognise in our long conversations over 4 years, as it happens, that we were being quite focused on the things we knew best, which is, of course, the city we're all in now at the centre of. I feel that the two, I guess, other perspectives you've raised, the UK perspective, is it would be a valuable piece of research. I'm aware, for example, that there's a 70-storey tower just being centred in the centre of Manchester, where the land value economics of building are so different to London, and land value is, I think, one of the big underlying factors in the way we build in London. It's hard to build a 70-storey tower in London. It's almost the land's too expensive, if you see what I mean. So I think broadening the research to look at other centres in the UK would be helpful. But it is interesting having this conversation in the Hong Kong theatre, isn't it, where, and to think about cultures where actually high-rise living is the norm for the greater proportion of the population, and therefore has got to be a way to live communally. And so I think there are some interesting positive case studies to be looked at outside of the UK as well.
Thanks. Barbara in the middle. Wait for the mic, please.
Thanks so much. Barbara Brownlee, Chief Executive Soho Housing. In a past life, I have demolished quite a few tower blocks. And just as a very quick aside, it's not really the point I was going to make. One of them in Hackney, we had to rehouse about 6 people around one core on one floor along a street together because they were so tightly bound as a community and a group and looked after each other that otherwise they wouldn't move out. So I think there are examples, but I think you're right, research. I have no idea. What I was going to say is a great talk and really appreciate it and so agree that leasehold is a tenure that shouldn't exist and service charges are a minefield, really difficult and a time bomb for all of us coming. The thing that wasn't mentioned was heating systems. And I think it's one of the areas where I think one of the architects said regulation and reality haven't yet quite met. And the regulation around putting in sustainable heating systems and the cost for the end user of putting in and maintaining sustainable heating systems is incredible. And having been responsible for Ebury Bridge regeneration, huge amounts of research there and work done. And I just don't know how those poor residents are ever going to pay for it. And the council has no choice about putting in that type of heating system. And I think that just needs to be part of the debate. Thanks.
Thanks. Roger and possibly Douglas, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the only comment I would probably make as someone in legal practice is that I agree. I think heating systems and understanding actually what the end cost to the user is going to be is a very good example of things that it's often come from planning requirements and it's fitted in to suit the planners, but actually how much thought goes into what it is going to cost over the lifetime of the lease. And then at the moment, of course, with all of the energy price rises, it's fair to say that is a topical issue at this precise moment as well.
Can I just add that there's a growing move to put underfloor heating in for very understandable reasons, very pleasant and all the rest of it. There's one thing taking off a lot of radiators and replacing them? Or what are you going to do when underfloor heating needs to be replaced? You know, it's enormously complex, and yet you'll have 100, 200 leaseholders who are going to be facing the same problem at the same time, but actually in that case almost certainly be individually responsible, except for the hot water that will flow through those heating systems.
Right, we'll take some from this side of the room. I have two hands together, so why don't we get those two questions together, and then I'll just do one or two after that.
Hi, I'm Deborah Udall from SAY. We're a consultancy that advise on operational costs and service charges, and we've got lots of service charge data, if you'd like it. We've just done quite a lot of benchmarking of service charge costs. We've also worked on about 25% of the new towers in London, doing operational management and service charge costs, and worked on Elephant Park and Ebury. Very willing to help. I think the points you've made are really interesting, and one of the things that I wondered if you've looked at is alternative ownership structures, things like community interest companies to help pay for some of the public realm that is now the responsibility of the leaseholders rather than the local authorities. And I suppose my other comment would be, do you think that architects are changing their approach when they're looking at the design of buildings to consider in more detail long-term operational and life cycle costs? Because I have to say that our experience is often that we're the first people to question that, apart from when it's a build-to-rent scheme.
And can you pass the mic to the gentleman next to you?
Yes, thank you. James Pargeter from Global Apartment Advisors. Leading neatly on from Deborah's question, I appreciate all the problems that have been outlined regarding ownership structures. You know, you've got freeholders, leaseholders who then let out to other occupiers, affordable housing operators working in the same building. And you think, well, wouldn't it be great to just get rid of that structure and that system? In many ways, you know, the build-to-rent model does that, and I don't know if it's mentioned at all within your book, but to what extent do you think that that can answer some of the problems where you've got a building that's been purpose-designed, purpose-constructed, and then is purpose-managed and maintained into the future by a single body that has responsibility for the whole thing without service charge additionally being passed on to the residents?
Right, thank you. Who would like to speak to ownership structures? Roger? Was that?
You do
Douglas?
the first question.
I can't do the ownership model.
I'm happy to comment on the ownership.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shall I could say something about the, you know, do designers think about longevity, lifetime? Yes, we do, particularly in London. I think it's a requirement now to look at lifetime costing of the building, embodied carbon, that kind of thing, the impact on the environment. I think also technically, as we're designing buildings, I was saying earlier, you know, we have projects that are like 15 stories tall, and we have bricklayers laying individual bricks 15 stories up, and it's ridiculous. You wouldn't get a commercial building in a city being built like that. They're built in a factory, panelised and craned into place. So the residential construction sector has to catch up and learn, and I think that's part of the issue. You know, there are too many mistakes made on site using traditional methods at height, when it could be much more. Yeah, access to services. We think about that. You know, the question over here about how do you, you know, the services have changed. Only 5 years ago, we were putting in combined heat and power systems powered by wood pellets. We no longer do that. We've moved on, and it is ridiculous, isn't it? How quickly these things come and go, and they're very major things. You know, big impacts on the people that live there.
Yeah, in terms of ownership structures, I think what I would say is, to an extent, I sort of stick up for leasehold sometimes, because unless and until we come up with an actual viable alternative that's actually better, then I don't really see. I mean, I know there's quite a focus on common hold, whether common hold can be made viable. There are only about 8 schemes in the entire country that have ever used it, and it really is just it's just moving the deck chairs around, to my mind, because especially now that ground rents have been abolished, and you will see most freeholders will now be owned by the leaseholders anyway. It'll be just a leasehold-owned company. So that's just basically the same as common hold. Ultimately, if you are going to own a long-term capital asset, you are going to be responsible for the costs of maintenance. And for build to rent to become the future, you've got to get over that, haven't you? Because people aren't going to own it. The build to rent model is a relatively short-term rental model rather than actually owning.
Right, let's take 2 more questions and then we'll come back for more conversation. Yes, in the front row here.
Thank you. Andrew Boff from the London Assembly. I found it very difficult to resist during all the contributions from punching the air and shouting yes.
Oh, we wish you had.
Because for those of us who've been knocking on doors for the best part of 50 years, we've encountered we've encountered all these issues. But one of the things that's standing against perhaps high density but not low rise is the worry from developers and local authorities about what the effect would be if there were a general moratorium, for example, on tall buildings. What effect would that have on land values and developers if that were to take place in London?
Who would like to speculate about that?
Andrew can start.
Andrew.
Well,
and Dickon.
If I just start by saying one of the bits of research we did, research is the grand word for a slightly complex back of an envelope calculation, using the NLA's fantastic database now. We've had 10 years of the tall buildings, so they're about to be 11. So with a bit of help from Knight Frank, we looked not at this pipeline figure that always makes everyone say, whoa, 570, I think it was, 72, but at the actual completions. And if you look at 10 years of completions, it's much more modest. Now, it may be accelerating now, and we have to look at that, but if you just look at the 10 years completions, and you compare, and you have to do a bit of extrapolating to convert buildings into numbers of homes, and then you compare that with London's current annual target of 52,000 homes. It's less than 5%, it's 4-point-something%, has been delivered by tall towers, that's say 20 stories plus. A great many more will have been delivered in the 10 to 20 story range. But I just start there in response to your question, because actually, although 4-point-something% it's a significant contribution to London's housing crisis, if you want to call it that, certainly our housing needs. And by the way, that doesn't account for the number of homes that are actually bought as investments and left empty, because none of us know how many of those there are. It's significant, but it's not that many, is it, when you think of the visual impact of all of that stuff? So my point is, if you were not to do that, hypothetically, and I'm not necessarily recommending this, but if you were just to stop doing that, the impact is not that great, really. It moves us on to a different conversation about where would you build, but maybe that's for another day. Others.
Dickon?
Oh, and just to say that one of the problems about not doing the research is we just don't know who's buying or who's living in these tall buildings. But there's a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that a great many of them were bought by people domiciled in other countries, particularly the Far East. I think it's well known that they're targeted by developers. So my suggestion would be that any of the home which is bought by somebody from abroad should not count towards a local authority's housing targets. It should be regarded as something entirely surplus and disregarded. Now, whether that would mean that planning authorities would be less positive about consenting these schemes, that's certainly a possibility. I'm quite agnostic about whether we have towers or not. However, it wouldn't worry me if we didn't have any more particularly. And as for the impact on land values, I can't for the life of me think why anyone should really worry about that, least of all developers, unless they've already bought it. And this is what's been going on for years and years, is developers always overpay for land, and then they try and get it back through gaming the planning system. And why we go on giving in to that kind of blackmail is completely beyond me. So I say, call the bluff.
Right, we have time for one final question.
Kath, can I just pick up the point about build to rent?
Yeah.
Just briefly, because I do think that build to rent has legs. Because the people who are building it are actually interested in how long it's going to last. And it's very good that Roger talks about the work that architects are doing to look at how to build these buildings better. But actually, they're not the ones building them. The ones building them are developers and then a whole range of construction companies. And so even if it's terribly well designed, the combination of developer profit and design for build, and the approach that what's it called? Design and build, is likely to mitigate what the architects have in some cases been trying to do. In the case of build to rent, it is not in the interests of the owner to do anything other than try and build a building that will last and which is not going to be expensive to maintain.
Thanks, Jean. Do we have one more hand? Yes. Here, you get the last question.
Hi, I'm Belle Chan. I'm resident of the high-rise building. I'm just wondering about the regulation you mentioned earlier. So are these regulations on new high-rise or existing high-rise? And the other thing is it required by the law for these high-rise to have an AGM so that the tenants, the landlords could have a say and could have a look at the service charge?
Douglas, would you like to say what the law requires in terms of resident or owner participation?
On the latter question, I can. Yeah. I mean, it all depends on how the block is designed. So if it is a resident-owned landlord, then the residents or the leaseholders will own a share, and so theoretically, at least, yes. Well, they should be holding AGMs usually, and the benefit of having a resident-owned landlord is that the residents, if a majority choose to replace the managing agents, they can replace the managing agents. But it does ultimately depend from one scheme to the next on how it's been set up.
Right, thank you. I'm going to draw this to a close now and invite you all to stay and finish off all the food and wine so it doesn't go to waste, and encourage you to please pick up a copy of our little book on your way out, and this has really only been a taster of what's in it, so we look forward to continuing the dialogue. Thank you.